Okay, so it is really a pleasure to welcome Christophe Schuwey virtually to the CUNY Graduate Center. An associate professor of digital humanities and book history at the Université de Bretagne Sud, his research is situated at the productive intersection of digital humanities, book history, and early modern French literature. He's the author of several important books, including the groundbreaking study of Donneau de Visé titled An Entrepreneur des Lettres au XVIIe siècle, as well as an important survey of digital humanities, Interface, l'apport des humanités numériques à la littérature, and numerous articles. And I think of a particularly important one on the versions of La Bruyère's Caractère. He also created multiple digital editions and databases, including the Nouvelle Nouvelle with Claude Bourqui and the Alcoran de Louis XIV with Katharine Laporta of NYU. One of the many things I truly admire about his research is that he invites us to think of literature not as a series of discrete final artifacts that we can examine comparatively, but as a dynamic process of production that includes publication and reception by readers, the full range of Darnton's communication circuit, as well as versioning for specific purposes by writers. That is the way writers cut and paste, recycle, and reuse previous writings. And this afternoon, he will speak to us about digital interfaces and the politics of literature. So please join me in welcoming Professor Christophe Schuwey.
Thank you so much, Professor Eric Koch, for such a generous presentation. And you just said this afternoon, I realized it is afternoon for you, so it's a bit, I was surprised to see so many people so late in the evening, but actually for many of you, it's still the afternoon. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you, and I would like to thank the Department of French of Comparative Literature and the Digital Humanities program at the Graduate Center for offering me such opportunity to share with you some thoughts and research. It is really, truly an honor for me to be speaking in such a cutting-edge program in digital humanities. For me, for many years, what CUNY is doing in digital humanities is really a model, and I admired it. So it really means something to speak here today, this afternoon / evening. And as I was telling Eric Koch, it is bittersweet not to be there in person, although a digital lecture might be fitting for such topic. But I do hope to meet some of you, most of you in real life sooner than later. So I will start by sharing my screen. There, and I hope you can, can you see my screen? Perfect, okay. So from the Black Bibliography Project to automated text analysis, from digital editions to the digital garden here at the Graduate Center at CUNY, from manifold to upcoming databases on non-authorial paratext by colleague Andy Silva from the English department, digital humanities are diverse and vibrant. And for decades now, they have undeniably transformed the way we work in literature. They greatly contributed opening the canon. They transformed the way we access text and books, and they made new inquiry possible in countless ways. And yet, digital humanities were still qualified as a debacle as recently as 2019. You might have heard of the Digital Humanities War, which is a series of controversial articles in the Chronicles of Higher Education, pro and contra digital humanities. Or should we say maybe the Computational Humanities War? Because the criticism is recurrent, it's not always the same. Computers are incapable of properly analyzing literary text, therefore funding for this type of research and implicitly for digital humanities as a whole should stop. So after Timothy Brennan wrote the Digital Humanities Bust in 2017, the latest article from this series from 2019, and it's called The Digital Humanities Debacle and was written by Nanda. So this article that you see here in its Chronicle of Higher Education version stems from another much longer article she published a few months earlier in Critical Inquiry called The Computational Case Against Computational Literature. And in the weeks and months following the publication of this article, it gave rise, as any important article, to an interesting debate, but unfortunately also very bitter. So rest assured today my intention is not to add an unnecessary contribution 4 years later to this debate. If I'm bringing back this digital humanities war here tonight, it is to look at the way it is shaped, to lay out what was left out, especially materiality, and as a way to move forward in the way we think about digital humanities. So in her article, Daz takes on various computational literary studies, and I will use the acronym CLS afterwards, so for computational literary studies. And she criticized their results as either statistically flawed or uninteresting. To give an example, she takes on Andrew Piper's computational analysis of Augustine's Confessions. So using CLS, Piper detected a shift in style and vocabulary in the last 3 chapters of the Confessions. And Piper analyzed this shift as a reflection of the author's conversion in the text. And Daz calls out the interpretation for not taking account of some basic facts here. Anyone who, I'm quoting her, anyone who has read Confessions knows that the last 3 chapters differ from the first 10 because Augustine turns to discussion of Genesis after spending 10 chapters on autobiography. And so of course, different words will start to show up. All right, hard lecture here. However, what is interesting for me here is this kind of interpretation only a matter of digital humanities? Are digital humanities really what triggers this kind of readings, whether this reading is right or not? And if not, where does this kind of interpretation comes from? This very idea of linking the text to the author's personal experience, this fascination with author and their personal journey, with this implicit hope of accessing the author interiority through a text that is in turn accessed as something abstract and completely unmediated. Is it really only the digital humanities that are doing that? Isn't it such analysis strikingly close to a certain kind of literary analysis? It seems to me that Piper's question and answers are thoroughly shaped by literary studies. It does seem strange that some literary scholars focus on something like CLS to attack digital humanities, something that is so close to their question and almost their method. After all, literature too has been very comfortable doing purely textual ideal analysis, not taking into account some parameters like, for instance, materiality, politics, editorial context, gender, to name only a few. So why is literature aiming at CLS? And I would argue that if CLS is the main target here, it is precisely because CLS is too close, because it mimics some methods and aims of literary studies. It reflects, it brings back an image of literary studies that makes the field uncomfortable, specifically uncomfortable. And conversely, the prominent place of CLS in digital humanities stems from the same toxic relationship. Because in order to build legitimacy, it seemed essential at one point to address questions exactly the way they were framed in literature department. Somehow they are 2 faces of the same coin, trapped into this kind of toxic relationship with an obsession for extremely textual interpretations. So this computational humanities war, for me, appears more and more to what psychoanalysis would call a crisis. And the obsession for CLS and for textual analysis, some sort of fixed idea. As a crisis, it reveals something of both fields. Behind the critique of digital humanities, there are deep political questions that goes far beyond, I think, funding issues, even if those are, of course, real. Issues of authority and power struggles, of method. There are issues of canon, of accessibility, inclusivity, which digital humanities reshapes and challenge. And for some part of digital humanities, there is a bizarre fascination with the most radical textual literary analysis that shaped part of the field in a way that I would call a data-obsessed way. Indeed, the effort, the energy deployed around this very specific question of automated analysis, CLS, is striking, and it prevents other questions to be at the forefront, to be in the conversation. The whole forum that followed Nanda's article in 2019 showed many blind spots, both in the pro and contra response. One in particular is striking to me, one blind spot in particular, and it's this blind spot is materiality. The debate is centered only on textual inquiries in their most abstract forms: words, sentences, style. In 2019, after decades of digital humanities, of databases that changed the way we work, digital libraries, new interfaces, new accessibility to rare books, archives, documents, all the work by librarians to put on archives in various way online, but also after decades of material bibliography, book history, material text, after all that, the obsession for computational analysis is centered on text. In the debates in the forum, only Katherine Bode raised this issue, and I quote, "That omits what I'd call digital literary scholarship, philological, curatorial, and media archaeological approaches to digital collections and data." But, and that might be the most important point, but that perspective is mirrored by many of the researchers she cites. As Bode points out, DAS is certainly not to blame here. The obsession for CLS and textual approaches is to some extent how digital humanities advertise themselves and appeared in the public debate. I'm thinking here of some of the Franco Moretti's appearance in the New York Times. In communication, in media outreach, conversation in digital humanities, perception of digital humanities is what I would call the graph maps trees paradigm. It has been dominant for the past decade, despite all the energy that has been put in other projects. So fortunately, every crisis is also a way forward. Understanding what is at play here is, I believe, a way to move forward in this conversation and in digital humanities in general. And today I would like to break the circle by doing a bit of therapy together, more seriously, to go through this question again. And first, I will remind briefly how big data and computational analysis are for and extremely useful for literature, and why the case is actually often not well laid out. And second, I will question the textual obsession and why materiality, media, and material text are mostly absent from this conversation. And from there, as a third point, I would propose approaching digital humanities as interfaces, fundamentally an interfaces between human and text. And this concept, I believe, allows to discuss the array of convergent practices that digital humanities are. And I will show some concrete examples at the end of what digital humanities then, in this way, can do for literature, and not to literature, but for literature. And before doing this, especially since I know there are many graduate students here, I would like to acknowledge my privilege, not only as a white cis male, having a platform here. Also, I would like to acknowledge the privilege of being a tenured associate professor. For having been now for quite some years in a non-tenured position, I would like to acknowledge here how much easier it is to say what follows in a tenured position. So, in Big Doubts About Big Data, which is an article that was published in the Digital Humanities War series, Emma Pritchard wrote, "Big data can be usefully applied to some kind of problem, but not to others." Simple and wise. Indeed, it is not the big data itself that is useful. It is useful when scholars use it in a meaningful way in their research. And an excellent example of that is the full text search on massive corpuses. I will take here the most canonical case for French literature, Molière, the French Shakespeare. In 2010, the publication of the new edition of Molière's complete works marked a double revolution. First, the editors discovered an overwhelming amount of sources that shed a new light on Molière's play. In fact, 70% of the material presented in the introduction and the notes have never been identified in any previous edition. And moreover, these sources were made available online through an open data website, which allowed for unprecedented access, enabling scholars and also enthusiasts, actors, practitioners, students, to conduct their own studies and discover new texts. These findings reveal that much of Molière's work were first and foremost inspired by contemporary, fashionable plays and books instead of a long-going classical tradition. It also had socio-historical implication. We learned that, for instance, his references to popular culture did not stem from his travels outside Paris, but rather from copying other plays using the same so-called popular language. And perhaps, and most significantly, we discover that a play as famous as The Misanthrope owes a great deal to a woman star and author like Marie-Catherine Desjardins, who was a superstar back then and who wrote many plays that today become widely available through critical edition, paper critical edition, but also digitization. So how can we explain those groundbreaking discoveries? 70% of new sources on a canonical author is, I think you will agree, quite huge. How can we explain that after 2 centuries of studying Molière's work? Well, the overwhelming majority of discoveries came from full text searches on digital libraries like Gallica, Google Books, and Open Library. Using their experience and skills, the editors identified lines that appeared to be of particular interest and performed full text searches across these massive corpuses. As a result, here you can see Marie-Catherine Desjardins. As a result, they uncovered numerous works that have been long forgotten and lost in libraries. So instant full text searches, the availability of the tool, such as Google Book, allows scholars to try multiple questions, multiple queries, and therefore leads to discovery fast, and also discoveries that are original because they could try many queries and not just one. It's not like if you have to browse again the whole library every time you have a new question. Now, I'm not saying by any way, and I would like to highlight that very much, that editing a text is just doing some full text searches on Google Books. It is the fortunate combination of a powerful tool, a vast corpus, and the skill and works of people that makes the whole so effective. Full text search on Google Books is not useful in or and of itself and provides no answer by itself. Big data doesn't provide answer by itself. Rather, it requires the discerning eye of a scholar to identify line and passages of interest and to browse through the result to uncover the most valuable insights. Ultimately, it is a combination of technology and human expertise that makes this discovery possible. But for this to happen, it requires an interface that makes the data findable, usable, searchable easily. Without this simple search field, without the search algorithm behind it, the same data would not allow for anything. In this case, data without interface, data that is not inquired by human, virtually does not exist. So why is such success, we can see for digital tools, not better broadcasted? It's both a problem, I believe, in literature and in digital humanities. So for literature, finding sources in itself is not as engaging at first sight as, for instance, a groundbreaking theory. And yet finding sources is not a matter of stereo scholarship. It comes with a heavy political and social payload. Finding that an author like Molière borrowed from so many other authors is one of the strongest possible arguments to challenge the canon, to move away from the few canonical references, to look at marginalized works, authors, and questions. Of course, ideally, we would not need Molière anymore to do that. But this was 2010, and this was a first step for French studies in this way, to acknowledge how important were authors previously deemed as minor, especially Marie-Catherine Desjardins, who already benefited from a lot of work, but when it's backed by Molière, it helps. Suddenly, thanks to the availability, searchability of this text, it appears impossible to read only canonical text and working in the 17th century. And we can see why this is challenging for literary studies. At least the computed literary studies, computational literary studies are working within the same frame, with the same great authors, the great text, with notions like genres, poetry, epic, something that we can talk. It's good company. The example I've just described, although canonical, goes against many traditions. It is fast, almost too fast. It brings a lot of new names and new authors in the mix. It challenges the consensus, but not with a big idea. And it changes the whole meaning and interpretation of a whole literary monument, namely Molière. It brings some sort of chaos to pre-existing knowledge and canon. Moreover, despite scholars having a central role in this edition, their authority might be challenged. If it is possible in a few clicks to find sources that would previously require so many years of knowledge and readings, then authoritative essays might be at risk. And it also challenges the academic conversation. If we cannot work around the small number of texts, if we're not summoning the same reference or at least the same questions, therefore it is less clear to see who is doing good work, what is a good work, and to assess it in terms of real university politics. But the case of Molière would also be a perfect case for digital humanities, and yet it is not. There are many reasons for that. First of all, I think the editors of the Molière's complete work did not communicate it effectively around it to digital humanities. But another explanation here is that precisely it is not automated. It is not this Alan Turing-like automated machine producing results in itself. The fact that it requires a complex interaction between the scholar's skills and the machine, that it uses a tool, but that the machine is not producing results by itself, makes it a weaker case in appearance for digital humanities. In any case, we see how big data definitely plays into literary analysis and shift its speed and scope radically. And as soon as we do not expect automated results, then the possibilities are many. Two examples quickly that I'm trying to work on now. First, using style attributions of text. I'm trying to see, so we're talking in early modern a lot about the fact that we shouldn't dismiss the editor role, the publisher role in the text itself. But since we don't have the draft, it's very hard to quantify how much we owe to the publisher, to the printer, to the worker. Well, if we do stylistic, if we analyze the style on a big corpus and try to see if there are things that comes not from the authors, but from the same printers or from the same publisher, then we have a clue, even without draft, that there is something important coming directly from the publisher or the printer. Right, so that's one case of inquiry that seems meaningful to me. Another one is to inquire into early modern attention span. Text can be a fabulous archive to catch an evolution in the attention span, but it's required to take into account many parameters, from sentence lengths to paragraph lengths to the use of anaphorical pronouns and so on. All this possibly on a large corpus. And this is exactly the kind of scenario where computers will never give an answer, but computer will help browse and give parameters that we can then take into account and work further. So in the end, what kind of big data isn't actually fit for literary analysis? And maybe it is the kind that hopes for computers to think for us. And trust me, even ChatGPT don't think really. It's not about thinking, even if they're running stress tests to see if ChatGPT would start to take over the world by itself. But it's just a matter of probability. It's not thinking. So it's when we expect to have magical answers coming from a lot of data. And this is where big data is not maybe fit for literature. We will always have insights, yes, but we don't have answers. But again, this is also a problem for literature. First of all, as scholars, we need to have actual questions to ask to the text to then use or not digital humanities capacity. Indeed, in the case of Piper essay, Das criticism does not target the finding per se. There is indeed a change of vocabulary in Augustine's last chapters. The criticism is merely that the analysis lacks of basic information. From this, Das concludes that a computer literary analysis, and I quote, and I lost my quote, I'm sorry for that. Okay, I will quote it. That computer literary analysis always involves a significant loss of information. The question is whether that loss of information matters. So this is undoubtedly true. The question is, didn't we engage with text as data with a heavy loss of information for a much longer time than the rise of digital humanities? Indeed, the loss of information in CLS is only the latest in a long-going tradition of textual culture. Let me remind here that the fundamental notion of text is by essence a loss of data. The idea that there is an abstract idea of a text that despite its variations in media, formats, shape, and form, spelling, it can be considered as the same text. And that these changes are irrelevant somehow to literary analysis, or that there could be a literary analysis without considering them. This is already text turned into data. This is already information turned into data with a loss of information. And CLS directly stems from this tradition. We could never have transformed the text into data the way we did without first considering that the text, printed or manuscript, can exist independently from its materiality. Literary analysis, modern edition, and so on are built on this fundamental premise. And let me take here to show how I think important it is, the case of Blaise Pascal, and this is for Eric Corr. So famous mathematician, philosopher, Pascal was also, as you know, a religious writer. And before dying, he left a collection of multiple manuscripts, the Lias, thoughts and sketches for an upcoming project about religion in the following of the Provincial. This collection would soon be edited by his family as the Pensée, the famous Pensée, and this is how they came to us. But today, besides specialists, many scholars access Pascal's through the 1905 Brunswick edition. And so not only we are not working with the manuscripts anymore, which, as you can see, are hard to read, but it's not even in the original publication format, because the Brunswick edition organizes Pascal Pensée, Pascal thoughts, Pascal remarks thematically. And Brunswick is the last of a long tradition of editors who try to make sense of all the manuscripts and sketches to organize them in a meaningful way. However, in the original manuscripts or the original edition, this was not at all the case, not even the original plan in any respect. So this authoritative edition that many scholars accessed Pascal with creates a huge loss of information. Remarks are mixed, cleaned up from the manuscript, possibly modernized, but they also add information that were not the author's original intention, adding themes, organizing this remark by theme. Again, I am not saying at all that it's not good. Of course, there will be no literary studies without such loss of data, without accepting such loss of data. What I'm more interested in is that we have accepted this abstraction that is the text, but we are still discussing, and it's healthy, the loss of data in digitization. And this conversation is essential. We know, for instance, what bad OCR can do depending on the case. We also know that online version of text come from often unidentified sources, which is really a problem, using editions that are old edition, mixing old edition with new editions as if it was the same thing. I like to tell my students in digital edition in Lorient, imagine if we were reading medical advice from 19th century books just because they are available on a random website and more easily accessible, right? That would be ill-advised. But this is a bit what we're doing when for instance, we pick, if we pick a random text online just because it is available. So this question of loss of data is problematic and needs this conversation. But to this question of loss of data, actually digital humanities are a paradigmatic shift, and it's actually bringing back, I think, data. Because the digitization of books and archives have been the first occasion, probably since the invention of print, to make early modern texts readable again in their original setting without going to a rare book library or having a personal collection of early modern books. Descartes, for instance, is not only a philosopher anymore. His texts are not only ideas, they are also books, media on a market that competes, which titles are shaped by this market and so on. And we can see that not in this clean white paper critical edition, but in its original format. And this is actually one of Digital Humanities' most obvious contribution, I believe, to literature. So, of course, speaking of materiality in the digital world is quite paradoxical. Yet accessing a book through the picture of its original version and accessing the multiple version of its materiality through photographs is infinitely closer to the original materiality than what a modern critical edition can offer. Of course, that's also a transfer delusion that comes with a lot of issues, and I'm glad to discuss that in the question. But fundamentally, digital humanities are bringing back information more than losing data. And the fact that scholars can access so many books, including forgotten books, so many different editions, not going to a rare book library, but from a computer screen, the fact that it is not something special anymore, but part of the regular research workflow, that original typeface and page setting are as common as the text itself, all this reconnects the text and the materiality together. All this, I think, brings back both. And this is a very simple example. There are so many digital projects that are bringing the materiality in a way or another. I quoted in my introduction, Jackie Goldsby Black Bibliography Project, or Andy Silva's database on non-auctorial paratext that brings editorial issue at the forefront that allows to analyze this incredibly important corpus from a database. And finally, I would highlight that the digital division between data on the one hand and visualization on the other hand invite us to rethink the separation between the medium and the text. For the first time, this was an example of how even on a screen, there is one version that is infinitely closer to the original materiality than the other one, and that any critical edition can ever dream to be, except for facsimile. And so finally, that the division in the digital division between data on the one hand and visualization on the others allows us to rethink the separation between the medium and the text. For the first time, we can stage the same document that you can see here. This is a part of the Alcoran de Louis XIV that we did with Catherine Laporta that Eric Koch was nice enough to mention. So from this same document, we can stage in almost one click in various displays and format. So this is one version of this document visualized in the form of an ebook, and this is the same text, but visualized in a different format. And this allows to stage the text in different way, various displays and format on various devices, and test the difference, test some hypothesis about reading, about experience, about attention, etc. And yet, although Google Books was at some point the center of attention, the real value of such massive digitization is once again, at least, to say the least, not at the forefront of the debate. And there, again, I think this blind spot is telling. So for literary studies, CLS at least buys into the fundamentals of the discipline and is centered on text and theory. From a textual stylistic perspective, materiality is hard to assess and hard to handle, or even not on the radar. Indeed, materiality challenges purely textual analysis of a work and authoritative interpretation, bringing in complex parameters and relativism to any authoritative reading. What about the intervention of the editors? What about the audience? Who read it and how? Who understand this text the way we're analyzing it? Were Racine, Pascal, Molière writing to promote ideas or to move on with their careers, or both? It is, for instance, quite tempting to read a lot in a title, but what if the title was a marketing coup, first and foremost? So in French literature, we have this famous case of les précieuses ridicules. Because of its title, the play has been analyzed for centuries as a comedy mocking the very real proto-feminist movement of the 1650s, 1660s in France, because in the name précieuse being a kind of a misogynistic stereotype. However, looking deeper at the text, the title of Précieuse Ridicule is deceptive and came only at a very late stage. The play is in fact merely a writing of an older play, the Visionnaire, completely unrelated to the social question of the précieuse or women rights. And another piece, a satire of contemporary fashion. And Molière bring back this together, and by opportunistically, when the debate was heated around this word of the précieuse, use very cleverly this title in his play, but the original intent of the play is not this. So this is the kind of question that materiality brings in. And then there is a lot of byproducts that are, or derivatives that are published very fast, all seems to address, but none of them actually addressing the actual question of the précieuses. They're kind of reacting and building on Molière marketing coup. And in fact, the trend goes away pretty quickly. The trend around the word précieuse, of course, not the social movement, which is extremely important, but the trend around the word précieux. So it's mostly an editorial marketing coup. But materiality is also an issue for digital humanities, as it contradicts the data-driven approach. Text as data is comfortable. You can parse it, you can analyze it, you can get metrics. Materiality, on the other hand, shapes the shape this data should take, the way we should visualize it, all the question of affects, all this human part of it makes it much more blurry, much more difficult to assess, and in my opinion, much more interesting. Despite the design turn in digital humanities, it stays second in the order of dignity. And the illusion at play here is once again akin, I think, to the idea of the text, that the data itself exists in itself, outside of any visualization, outside of any interface. There is an illusion that, like the text could be neutral, the data could be neutral. And Johanna Drucker wrote in Graphisis that data, she reminds us that data does not have an inherent visual form that merely gives rise to a graphic expression. So any visualization, every time we're accessing the data that is 1 and 0 in the digital form, basically, every time we're accessing it, whether through a word processor, whether through a fancy interface, whether through a completely crazy artistic project, wonderful artistic project, every time it's a different interpretation of this data. It's not neutral. And there is, although there is the work of Johanna Drucker and many others on this question, but still there is a lack of strong research effort, at least compared to what data-driven approach benefited from. And it shows in the moment we are in, sometimes called as the age of the digital incunabula. Because thanks to a lot of work from the whole digital humanities community, we have today clear standards for encoding data, for encoding text, for encoding images, to some extent for encoding sounds. This now, because there was work on it, we know how to do it. And it favors both interoperability and sustainability. But no consensus in 2023 or standard really has yet emerged in terms of interfaces. What should a digital edition, for instance, look like? What should a database look like? There is still no clear answer to that. Despite the calls from the Digital Humanities Manifesto from 2007 to emancipate the digital from the logics of print, despite recent works such as the wonderful Digital New Worlds by Roopika Risam for a more inclusive digital humanities, emancipating digital humanities from its obsession with data, the solution is still either to reproduce the logic of print on the screen, be it ebooks or website, or to create brand new interfaces that are fascinating in terms of innovation, but which require such relearning on the part of the users that it becomes complicated to access. So the lack of concern for visualization translates into both private and public policies regarding digital humanities. We have standardized data formats that could be saved through duplication. We don't have anything similar for visualization. In France, the national policy about data preservation is about data preservation. There is nothing in place to save anything related to visualization of data. It's about saving data, and by some magic, data will be visualized again. I think that Switzerland adopted the same approach. It is purely data-driven approach. But when you see what the digital editions that exist, all the digital databases, you can see, and I will show a couple of examples, that some of the project, the heart of the project is less in the data itself than the way it is visualized. And we have no conservation policies for that for now, and that's an urgent topic. And I think there's a whole Platonician undertone to all that. I think we're replaying the cavern story. The data is what matters, and the images, the visualization is what we should look away from. Is what is not really real. It's not what is not really important. It's just an illusion, and the data is the very idea with a big I, a capital I. And I propose we revert such thinking. So, in order to break the circle, I believe we need to get out of such narrow interpretative approach, both in literature and digital humanities. For digital humanities to address, and I quote here the CUNY Digital Humanities Center project, to address the ethical, social, and political issues relevant to local and global communities, which I absolutely agree with. We might need to go beyond CLS, which is one part of digital humanities, and approach digital humanities in a way that fully takes into account the whole diversity of the field and the vibrance of what is possible with digital and the digital media. And to do that, I propose to approach digital humanities first and foremost as interfaces between scholars and their object. I like this definition, simple definition of an interface, because this is the point where two subjects, system, etc., meet and affect each other. And for digital humanities, I think it's exactly what is at play when we approach them as interface. Interface is a twofold. It's first the way information is presented to us. So the way we can interact with them, for instance, the search bar in Google Books, or the fact that we can click on something to get information, etc. And as we saw for scholars, it is very important that this interface should be accessible, easy to use, and for everyone, by the way, but especially for digital humanities to be meaningful for research, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be usable, it needs to be not necessarily simple, but it needs to make sense. So that's where we meet. Do we meet with the data? This is the place where we meet with the data. There is no other way of meeting with the data than through an interface, whether it is code, Python script, or a beautiful well-designed interface. In every case, there is an interface, and this is where we meet with the data. And this is the affect part of it. Interfaces is also an opportunity to shape the perception of data. And here, I think, is where digital humanities can do something different. If, like materiality, interface is not transparent, then the sensible space is where practical skills, humanistic knowledge comes into play. It's where we first research on a work, on a book, on a corpus, on a data, on a map, on sound, and then from the finding, from the scholarly work, we can design something that would transmit, that would allow for others to understand what we want to show with this book. Thinking of digital humanities as interfaces allows to fully embrace, I think, the potential of digital. In a seminal paper, Roopika Risam invited a shift away from data to focus primarily on interface design in order to bring an intersectional approach to digital humanities in both design and interpretation. Working on the issue, so she was in another article, she was working on the issue of migration and migrants. So she proposed we should not jump into representing the official data available from governmental agency. Instead, we should find ways to represent the diversity and complexity of the migrant experience. And I quote her here, we should use because participatory methods, which include creating maps with the participation of migrants, can tell a different story from data, from official data, one that draws attention to the political, economic, and social problem subtending migration and reaffirms the humanity of migrants. They are not only data, they are experience. So a digital interface can represent that. But this requires not to start from the data and say we will just visualize the data. It needs to start from what do we want to communicate, what do we want to show, designing the interface, and then bringing the relevant data to it. And this, I believe, is a fundamental conception for digital humanities, because collecting data, then visualizing it, might lead to repeating the same bias already present in the data. Instead, starting from the interface, defining what we want to convey is absolutely not neutral, but it is aware. It is an active, conscious approach to this. Where we can design what we want to communicate and then take full advantage of the digital medium and unlock its potential. And indeed, for literary studies, this logic, I believe, is highly valuable and productive. And I will give you here three short examples. So the first one is about restaging theater. And this is an experiment we made with Geoffrey Tarnowski from the University of Washington in Seattle around a 17th century play. And it was in a graduate seminar, first year graduate seminar. So the seminar started with no digital at all. And we spent many weeks understanding the play itself, which was La Comédie sans titre by Edmé Bourseau, studying it from diverse perspectives, trying to understand both the play itself, how it works, this materiality, its place in the editorial context, in the context of theater in early modern France, etc. But once we got a good understanding, or at least what I assess as a good understanding of this play, each student had to pick one scene and create a digital edition of it. And students had the opportunity to start either by encoding the text and then creating an interface, or to start from a blank page, designing an interface, and then bringing in the data. And I will show you the difference. So the first project that you will see here is a group that started with the data, encoding the data, XML/TI, and then visualizing it. It's very good. There was excellent ideas about vocabulary, the dotted lines is explanation on the text, and you have the highlighted in light blue words that are words that can be transformed from the original spelling to a modernized spelling. It is, however, and this is not a criticism necessarily, it's however very close to what the play was on the page, right? It used an encoding that described the page, and then from there went to a project that shows a digitized version enhanced of the page. Another one, Legal Fields, start from the other side. She started from what kind of interface I can design. And she was interested in the fact that there was a scene that was extremely fast where everyone was speaking at the same time. And she bring in the idea that it is akin to a WhatsApp group conversation. And so she tried to replicate this on the screen with a very interesting thing that you can see here on the screen is that messages weren't there to start with. They appear depending on their length. So you have to wait longer to read a longer text. And it's a very interesting experiment in terms of reading, in terms of transposition of the text, and also very interesting to see that it's incredibly annoying. It's unreadable because the fact that you have to wait for the next message to appear when you're not active in the process in the WhatsApp group is really, really annoying. Which is a lot of which opens a lot of question and interrogation about how a theatrical text works, about why theater is represented in such a way, why is it set on the page in such a way. But it also allows to think about further, not this one, this is prototype, but about possible ways to translate early modern theater to various audiences. So, and this will be my second example. We did that again the next year, again with Geoffrey Tarnowski, around La Bruyère. And La Bruyère is a very interesting case because it's your typical case where the fact that it's canon and modern critical edition obfuscated the work, very complex editorial history, as Eric calls it, the versioning of the text, right? Because it has 8 editions printed in only 6 years, from 1688 to 1694, during the author lifetime. And every year, there is a new edition that is, for most of them, largely augmented. It's not just correction. From the first edition to the fourth edition, which is the first augmented edition, is the fourth edition. It almost doubles in terms of size, in terms of the number of remarks. And actually, it doubles not only because La Bruyère is working on this book. It doubles because it reacts to immediate topical issues of the time. So it looks like a book, but it works like some sort of annual periodical in the dignified shape of a book. It's a super complex, interesting object. Now, literary tradition turns this into a work, right? It's a work, it's canonical. You have modern edition, they show where the remarks appeared, but it's supposed to be the last edition, and the last edition is the good one. But La Bruyère is probably more interesting, I would argue, than that. And so this time we started, and I will change my screen here because I need to show you this live. And of course I lost my page. So this time sorry for that. This time we asked all the students to start from the interface. What's happening? The joy of the digital, speaking of which. Let's see. Oh God, this was really not the time for this to fail. Okay, I will have to describe it to you. But again, I'm here. Here it is. We're in the center of what I'm saying. We have no strong ways to ensure that digital interfaces are accessible at any time. So students devised multiple projects. And one that was especially interesting, for instance, was one where all the remarks in La Bruyère's character are devised into form of playing cards. And those playing cards can be shuffled in the interface. So you start with saying the normal playing cards, and in the normal order, and in the order of the book, and then you can click on a button to shuffle them and see how it works, how the same chapter works if you actually change the order of the remarks. And there was a great deal of scholarship around La Bruyère about the very precise plan. Actually, what La Bruyère adds from one edition to another is very carefully placed in a way that couldn't be in any other place. And using this interface, you can actually challenge this thing, because some of the shuffle doesn't work, but some of the shuffle actually gives you an idea of La Bruyère character where another order of his remark would work pretty well, right? There is, of course, the aligning translation with the English translation of the books, or visualization that allows to see, and that's bringing back the materiality, how the books grows from one edition to another, not in terms of number of remarks, but in terms of size of the book. So that's a couple of examples of the creativity that I think we can bring when we think not only about replicating the text on the screen, but starting with what do we actually want to show. Paper edition works. We don't need necessarily to have everything digital. So what are we gaining from going digital? What can we imagine going digital? And very quickly, and that will be my last example, it's how a database can actually make an argument by itself. This is a project that I started my dissertation with. It's called NCD17, and it's the acronym for the birth of dramatic criticism. And the whole idea of the project is that there was a whole corpus of texts that were commenting on 17th century shows that hasn't been identified as such and never taken together. So the database is made of now I think 4,000 excerpts. Some excerpts are one line, some of them are complete text. But what I'm interested in here in terms of interface is the fact that the database welcomes us with this screen. So this screen is classifying the excerpts not by authors, or not even by date, even if it's possible to access them by date, or not even by the show that is commented on. It organizes this writing about 17th century shows by medium. So you have memoir and newspapers and letters and anecdotes collection and poetry collection and novels, etc., etc. And I believe that this is a strong choice. This is not neutral. This choice is saying something immediately. It's saying that there is writing about 17th century shows on many, many diverse media. And if you want to understand what 17th century theater is, you might have to look beyond only the play itself or the most obvious resources that you may think of. But of course, and this will be my conclusion, to understand, to value this kind of approach, to value what Google Books can do, to value what inclusive interface can do, we have to look beyond a purely textual stylistic approach to literature. If we only look for an immanent meaning in the text, then there is no point in all that, because we are doing that probably better than any computer already, right? To recognize what digital humanities can do for literature requires to challenge the very notion of literature. If digital humanities are only copying the literary field, then trying to play the same game, I'm not sure this is a case they can really win. Best case scenario, they will confirm what literature already decided to be true. And so they will be called out for being users. So it's a lose, I think it's a losing game. I believe digital literature are at their best for literature when they, for instance, bring back materiality, when they challenge the topical questions in literature, when they bring back some complexity that were forgotten, like in the case of La Bruyère, when they bring back more parameters, and when they allow to us as scholars to access these, to think these multiple parameters and communicate on this through the interface. They are interesting because they bring back diversity in the canon, because they make much more difficult to restrain the analysis to one text, one book, because they force us to think the book in its context, in its setting, and ultimately because they bring in some sort of good chaos. The one that brings creativity and new ideas, the one that is at the beginning of things. So we can get rid of the canon and yet approach the new text with the same questions, tools, and expectations than before. We can also change the questions, but ask them on the same very small subset of works. And in both scenarios, we might end up with very few progress, either confirming the bias already present in the canon or forcing new books into a very narrow subset of questions: style, aesthetics, author's personal experience, and so on. And this is, I think, the whole conundrum and the whole challenge. I believe that implies we change both the canon and the question. And this is how digital humanities can help, this is what digital humanities can help with as soon as we consider them for what they are, for an interface between scholars and the object they're studying. Thank you very much for your attention.
Christophe, thank you so much for a really thought-provoking and engaging talk. I did want to just quickly call attention to, pick up on a point that you yourself made, that Pierre Force put a link into the chat to an online edition of the Pensée, which collects all of the editions, as well as the manuscripts, so that you can compare them, and that's just a tremendous resource. I'm sure there are other questions, but actually, there is one thing I wanted to say just to get us started. I really, or two things. I mean, I really appreciate the, your early references to both Katherine Bode and to Andrew Piper, who sort of represent a schism among scholars who do digital humanities, and that, Katherine Bode is, of course, somebody who engages in book history and makes use of computational methods for book history, for history of editions. Andrew Piper, on the other hand, the kind of question that he engages in, you mentioned style, for example. It seems to me that for that kind of inquiry, we are really restricted by the tools that we have, and tools we've inherited from corpus linguistics, tools that whether you're working from something that's off the shelf or you are writing your own script, you're confined to word frequencies, collocates, to that kind of thing. I mean, the range of questions that you can ask and answer is inherently restricted. What do you take a side in that debate? Do do you, from what you've said, you seem to lean more towards book history, or do you see value also in pursuing the other kind of inquiry?
I do, and thank you very much for summarizing so well this schism indeed in the digital humanities, and so I'm both. This will be a very Swiss answer. I'm both taking sides and I'm not, and not only because I'm not I don't love confrontation. Again, probably my Swiss culture, but also because I think the issue for me is not in the as you said, the tools are extremely can really decide what we can do with them. And this is true also for interfaces. There is a tool that is widely used, a very good tool, by any means, that's called Omeka, that was developed by a museum, and that is widely proposed to French scholars as soon as they want to do an interface, because it supposedly fills in mostly all scenarios. And why not? But this has tremendous impact, because if you have to build what you want, if you have to show what you want to do using Omeka, it is deterministic, unless you're very strongly clear about what you want to display. It will determine a lot of what you will do. So what I'm pointing out going there is, I think that all the approaches make sense, and this is what I wanted to show with my first point. The question is precisely that: does it make sense? Where I disagree strongly with Nandas is that there is no chance that TLS can be relevant, because it's either flawed or it just confirm what it said. I think this is not true, and I think the example of a case like Molière is a good example of that. But the problem is, I think, when we want the computer or the tool to replace, to be something else than a tool. Right. And whether it is for interfaces, whether it is for the textual linguistics tools, when we want it to give it more than what it is supposed to give, then we run into something that makes no sense, and that seems illogical. I don't want to speak too much on this, but the question is so terrific. I was yesterday at a conference in Digital Humanities in Paris, where there was a lot of presentation around this kind of research, and researchers were very honest about the fact that when 2023 and still the models that are developing, the language model, even with the big language model that Google is developing, etc., it is still, when you go into a text and you ask the computer to do an automated analysis and trying to find complex things, like, for instance, what is the référent for il, when there's a il, what is it referring to? There is the percentage of successful detection is 80%, which is a lot, but also a lot of mistakes. It's 20% mistake. And I think the problem here is that we're trying to have computers replicating exactly the way we would engage with language. And we're trying, and this is an asymptotic, like we're trying to get closer, but at sometimes for what? At some point, what is the goal? And when we can define the goal, and this is why I'm insisting so much on interface. If we're having a clear goal about where we're going, then these tools might work or might not work, or we can improve it. But if the tool is pure speculative approach that at some point it will be 100%, I'm not sure. I'm not sure this will lead to even ChatGPT with its 175 billion parameters in its version 4 can still produce some things that are hallucinatory, because it's a computer. It's not a human. I think a bad understanding of Turing wrote on computers kind of created a lot of misunderstanding. But I don't want to rant on that too much.
And one other comment, if I can, I love the. I hope other people have seen it too. The edition of the Alcohol de Louis XIV that Christophe and Katie Laporta did. It's wonderful, but one of the hesitations I think people have is, well, you're getting away from the authentic text, right? That you are, that and that's what interfaces do also, right? But your example of La Bruyere I found fascinating, because by shuffling through the chapters and reordering the sections, you actually are you were actually producing a more authentic experience of reading the Caractère, which was read, in a consultative way and not, cover to cover from beginning to end. So, I mean, a great example of how it actually makes it more authentic to present it that way.
Well, I'm honored. Frankly, the point about interfaces is undoubtedly true. What I'm aiming at, and this is what this talk allowed me to think a bit more clearly, is that it's a matter of conversation, and it's a conversation that we're still not really having. I mean, I'm not dismissing the ton of scholarship that has been that have happened there on the question of interfaces, but we worked with modern edition for a very long time. Modern edition is incredibly far from some perspective from the original text. But what works with modern editions is that we agreed on mostly on what should stay and what should change, so we can understand kind of what we are facing. And the fact that there is no norm, that there is no, even it doesn't need to be a norm, because creativity is what's beautiful in the interface, but the fact that there is no clear conversation about what we are looking at in an interface is what missing, and this needs to happen, and I would like it to happen. And the same goes for digital preservation. One of the thing I'm hearing every time I'm talking about this is that, yes, but if interfaces are not, for instance, Omeka, if they're not standardized or manifold, which is a fabulous example from your university, if it's not standardized, then it's very difficult to maintain and to ensure that it will work, etc. So first of all, standardization does not ensure either that it will. It needs people. At some point, it needs people, and digital preservation requires different preservation than books. That's for sure. That we will not have the same thing as books. And so what should we do from there? Again, it cannot be just, oh, it will be difficult to preserve, so we should abandon that. Where this is this is one of the things that the digital can do. I think instead that this is really a conversation that should happen, because we really need to think hard about what should we do with digital interfaces? The same way we did for data. If data is in such good place, if I may say so, right now, is because a lot of people worked on that and made effort and worked together and collectively around defining standards. And this is missing for interfaces.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I do want to invite other questions and comments. I'm sure that Christophe would welcome any discussion that anybody would like to launch into.
I have kind of a potentially simple / naive question. Sorry, I just jumped in, Eric. Is that okay?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
About the sort of, for most of us sort of lay digital humanists, the interface that we're most familiar with is the search bar, and it's the most frustrating of interfaces, because yes, it's true that it's only ever as good as the algorithm, but then the whole thing about the interface is, what question are you asking the algorithm? And so I'm curious. I find Gallica to be a really, as a simple example, just some frustrating search engine. You sometimes get things you want, but oftentimes you don't get what you want. Yeah. Particularly if you're working in newsprint, which is what I work with mostly in the 19th century. I'm curious if I don't know if your work on this, if your research on this has prompted you to think about what we ask the search bar differently, right? I don't know if that's possible to do, like, other than just words, but I mean, have you thought about, how do you approach the search bar after having done the research that you've done? I don't know if that's a relevant question, but that's the question I was left with.
I believe that's not only relevant, that's terrific, because and this is exactly the kind of conversation I believe we should have about precise things like the search bar. What are we making of the search bar? And also I'm sorry to hear you have to work with the new Gallica policy on newspaper, with the whole retro news thing that is a soft version of hell.
Agreed, very much.
That's another debate, although very akin to this. I don't think I have a very satisfactory answer to that, except that your question really raised the issue. What are we doing with a search bar, and what are we expecting with the algorithm? We are left with there is an interesting operation that happens when we starting to work a lot with that, is that we whether we're coding or not, we're trying to analyze the algorithm. And from this analysis of algorithm, from the results, then we try to adapt the way we ask the search bar to get better results. Actually, that's fascinating. It's on the everyday. It's mostly annoying because we would like to reach to this thing, but there is something here in terms of interface that is huge in terms of accessing the documents. We have to understand the same way we had to understand libraries before, right? The file system, of course. But this is a different kind of understanding. It's about an algorithm that will not always produce what we expect and what we can do. There is this happening with the search bar. Some with ChatGPT, some people saying precisely the search bar moment has ended. It will still be a text field, but that we will be able of course, that's the very opposite. We will be left with trying to understand why this query prompted this, but only from a much more complicated thing. So there is an issue, and there is, of course, a huge political issue behind it, is that the algorithm decides what we're looking at. Yeah. So again, I can only lay out these things from your terrific prompt, but again, that's one of the conversations that should very much happen, not only as, oh, and this will be resolved by a new technology, but what is actually happening when we are accessing things through a search bar? And what can we do with a search bar to make it more? One thing I would say, for instance, it's on the NCD, Naissance de la critique dramatique project, the one on French theater criticism, we tried, so we had this advanced search form with multiple search bars, and you can search some excerpts by title of this excerpt. And we're like, okay, but the title, we gave it ourselves, so it doesn't make any sense. What will they be looking at? And so we added this thing, as in Google, with suggestion. As soon as you start typing, there are things that happen. And so this is a different kind of search bar. Immediately with adding this to the interface, it turns into some sort of serendipity thing, because you start typing something about, I don't know, to stay with my example, you start typing Molière, and you find out, for instance, a title that says, I don't know, Drunk Molière, or Molière in a bad place. And this creates curiosity, and what is Drunk Molière? What is Molière? And so this is already a different kind of search bar. Yeah, so thank you for raising this point in all its complexity.
Thanks.
I can share very quickly, because it finally, for some reason, it worked. The thing I was referring to, the La Bruyère caractère, and you can see, so it was a prototype, of course, but you can see here, so you're browsing through the remarks, and there. And that's a good example. Starting not with tout est dit et l'on vient trop tard, everything is said already and we are coming too late. But if we take away from many works the l'avertissement au lecteur, l'épidédicatoire, the dedicatory epistle, préface, the table, etc., that would be a good start to start a book too, right? So that's an example. Yeah.
Thank you, Christophe. I think we have time for one or two more questions if anybody wants to jump in.
Hi, Christophe. It's Katie. Apologies
Hi.
to everyone for my name. I'm not able to change it for some reason. This isn't Dan, Katie, Fabrice, Van, and a random guy. So this is actually what you just showed is a really good example, kind of as a springboard for my question, which is, I guess, whether there's kind of a tension in my mind anyway, between the capacity of the digital critical edition to enhance, alter, transform a reader's experience, right? There's an infinite number of ways that we can reimagine a book, a critical edition. But then I guess my question is, do you see any kind of shift towards standardization? I know this is something you raised towards the end and that already came up in Eric's questions, but I guess my question is, do you see anything, right, as kind of an expert in the field, do you see any shift towards, I don't know, increasing parameters being placed on what an erudite critical edition ought to look like?
I love your question. Dan, Katie, and a random guy.
Thanks, Eric, for changing my.
I love this question, and of course I'm not into the prediction business, but I think there is the question of standardization, and there is the question. There is one part of the question is where the standardization is. Does the standardization is the standardization happening? I'll get to it, and also, do we want it to be standardized? There is this press that where the Princesse de Clèves has been published recently. There's Lever Press, fantastic edition by 4 colleagues here. And what is striking is that it's extremely rich. Extremely rich in terms of content. They did an incredible thing. There are videos, there is analysis, there are pedagogical activities that are proposed, that there is everything you want. It's 850 pages. But the Lever Press standardized model turns this into roughly a big PDF with some things, with notes on the sides, which is great. But it's, for instance, the pedagogical activities could be, I don't know, presented differently or in a different space, or you can imagine having the text and the pedagogical prompt somewhere. It follows like pages. So it's considering the work that has been put into this edition, you think, well, that's a standardization, and is it a good thing? So, and this is a completely open question for me. I don't know. I don't know, but I think this is where the conversation should happen, is how do we move forward? Is standardization the only way? Or could we, for instance, imagine something like a soft standardization, something where we have a vocabulary of elements at our disposal, but that we can combine in a way more creatively than a books, and adding elements, for instance, that would be something. So yes, so I'm seeing some tentative standardization. Lever Press is one example. Manifold is an excellent example that brings in, for any digital edition, the possibility to comment on the text and to discuss on the text publicly, which is fantastic. But my question is, do we want to see what happened with print? So we move from the manuscript, we have this incunabula moment with a lot of creativity, and then most books are standardized with a couple of very creative books. Or do we want, or can we take another road that would both be standard enough for being accessible and approachable, and at the same time to leave more room and to trigger more creativity than just the logic of the print put on the screen? And I really don't know, but I think that's also part of the conversation. I hope this answers your fantastic question. Thanks for that.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question if anybody would like to go. And if not,
and I would, And I would say to Pierre Force's comment on the Pensée de Pascal, indeed, and that was that's a project that exists for a very long time, that is still there, that still works, and that perfectly sees the whole potential of the digital while being accessible. So indeed, that's one of the example I like to go to present what it doesn't have to be. When I'm speaking about interfaces, it doesn't have to be fancy. It's not this necessarily. It's not about beautifying necessarily the interface. It's about really what is the interaction we want to create between the object and the user. That I think is the real question.
Right, that edition of the Pensée is really interesting because it's not a fancy interface at all, and the whole thing was essentially designed by two people that just put in many hours on it, but it's an unbelievable object. It's really multidimensional. You have all the editions since 1670. You have all the different ways you can transcribe the text. You have links to the manuscript and also links to how the manuscript was originally presented and how they cut those large sheets of paper to turn them into fragments. So it has all the dimensions you could imagine, and clearly that would be impossible to do in a book. Absolutely, completely impossible.
Okay. Well, listen, this has been I hope you'll all join me in thanking Christophe for a really thought-provoking, engaging talk. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon and for your wonderful comments. And that will do it. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was a pleasure. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
So I will create a link with the video and make sure I get it to you. But we're still being recorded now, so.
Yeah. So, okay. Thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Christophe.
Johanna.
It was great.
Wow. I hope. I'm glad if you think so. It
Absolutely.
was fantastic for me, really. Talk to you soon on email or
Yes.
by email. Or, yeah, absolutely. Have
Anna,
a great
thank you.
rest of the day.
You
And
too.
have a great weekend.
You too.